Hey guys, welcome back to Wheelin' with Wally. Today I'm going to be changing out the transmission mount on my Jeep TJ with this polyurethane Daystar transmission mount. This transmission mount was around $130 to $150 shipped, and I believe I picked it up off Extreme Terrain. The general consensus on transmission mounts for Jeep TJs is that the stock OEM mounts are best. They are a rubber mount and they're said to transmit less vibration into the cab of the Jeep, but they stopped making those probably 3 or 4 years ago now. So you can't really find them, and if you can, it's probably the last one. So you have to go with these newer polyurethane ones, and the reason I'm changing mine is because when I was on my trip to Moab here recently, when I was hitting bumps, I could feel stuff kind of bouncing around under there and hitting the underside of my Jeep. And I also think it led to my rear drive shaft failing because it just wasn't held in place. So I'm gonna pull everything off, stick this mount on and see how it runs. Hopefully I don't get a ton of vibration inside the cab like I've heard that these polyurethane mounts can cause. So I'll grab you guys off the tripod and put you down here and show you what we need to do to change it. So the first thing we need to do is remove these 4 13mm nuts that hold the transmission mount to the skid plate. My skid plate might look a little different than yours because I have an aftermarket skid plate, but it should be the same concept. So now that those 4 bolts are off, the next step would be to unbolt the 6 bolts that hold the transfer case skid plate on. But before you do that, it's very important to use a jack and some jack stands to support the transmission and transfer case, because this skid plate is what holds those up. So if you drop this without supporting the transmission, it can fall down and hopefully not crush you, but at the very least cause some damage. So make sure you support this. It's kind of always a good rule of thumb to never trust your life or your equipment to a jack. Always use jack stands as well. So on the back side here, I'm going to try and support the yoke with this jack stand. So the jack stand's not quite touching there, but if it were to start to drop or lower because the jack started to release, it would land on that yoke and catch it. So this is kind of my crazy solution for lowering this skid plate because this is pretty heavy. I have another small cheap jack that doesn't get nearly high enough. So I have a block of wood between the jack and then the skid plate to help keep it up, and I've got a little bit of pressure on it, so now I can loosen these bolts and the skid plate won't move. And then I'm going to start to lower it, and as it lowers down, I'm going to let these jack stands I have on either side catch it, and then it should be low enough, it'll clear everything, and me and one other person can hold the skid plate and kind of slide it off to the side. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove these 5/8 inch skid plate bolts. I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2 and loosen this one, but I'm going to leave this one in just in case it slips or drops, and then I'll go to the other side, do the same thing, remove all but one of those and leave it pretty loose in there too. And then once I get my second person out here to help me, I'll unthread these by hand and get those off there, and then I'll start to lower the jack. On this side of the skid plate, you'll notice I only have 2 of the 3 bolts here. This one's missing. When I got this Jeep, this one was already broken off. Alright, so now we're going to take these bolts out and try and control this really heavy skid plate and lower it down with hopefully my transmission staying in place. We'll see how all that goes, but obviously kind of keep everything clear under here while you guys are doing this, just in case something gives out. Okay. You can bring your second. There you go. I'm just gonna... So here's the transmission mount. As you can see, it's kind of some old worn out rubber. I assume this is bad. I'm no transmission mount expert, but this is I don't know, easily moved by hand. That's probably not a great thing. So now to actually swap this out, you have 4 15mm bolts. You have 2 on each side. You need to go ahead and remove, and then this part will come off. All right, with this old worn out one off, we can toss it to the side, grab the new one, and it should just bolt right back on in its place. Which it seems like it will. It seems perfect. I am also going to put a tiny little dab of anti-seize on these because they are pretty old and rusty, so that'll help when I most likely have to take this off again in the future. I looked online for a minute until I think I found it. I believe these bolts are supposed to be tightened to 30 foot-pounds of torque, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now that you have those torqued down, go ahead and take these nuts off. If you haven't, you're going to need those off to put the skid plate back on. After a couple hundred miles, make sure you take a peek at these bolts and make sure they're still snug down. You do not want this to come loose. All right, so now we're ready to struggle to try and get this transfer case skid back on. Like I said, this one's really thick and it is damn heavy. If I had a second bigger jack, it would be pretty easy, or even like a transmission jack. Those would be great right now. But of course I don't. So I'm going to put you guys on a little hyperlapse here while I struggle to get it up there. It's just going to be me and my fiance and that baby jack trying to balance it and get it up there and get a bolt in on each side. It's not going to be fun, and hopefully I don't crush a toe or a finger. So I'm not sure if you guys could tell in the time lapse or not, but basically all we did was slide the transfer case skid in there, have these 2 jack stands, one on each side. We set it on top of the jack stands, and then one of us at a time raised the jack stand. The other person did the same thing, and we just kind of walked it up using the jack stand so we didn't have to sit there and try and hold it the whole time. Then we got the bolts in, and now I'm going to tighten these down. They need tightened to 55 foot-pounds of torque, which apparently I already went over with my impact. Yep, looks like I went way over it. Alright, well, that's why I use a torque wrench. So now I can go ahead and clear everything out from under here and lower the jack. The transmission is now going to be held up by the skid plate again, so I no longer need any of this under here. So now the last thing we have to do is put the 4 nuts back on here and tighten those down to 21 foot-pounds of torque. And one thing I will point out real quick is these new studs on this transmission mount, they kind of stick out a little past my skid plate, and that's not a good thing. I don't want that. So after I put these nuts on here, I might take a Dremel or something and cut those off. And that's not a great idea because it'll be harder to get the nuts on and off after that. But if you have them on there first, when you back them off, it should help clean up the threads. I don't plan on taking it back off anytime soon anyway, and for 130 bucks, I can always buy a new one if it does really mess them up. But if these are hanging down, they can easily catch on rocks and bend or get ripped off and break these studs that hold the transmission mount to the skid plate, and that's not something you want. So I'd rather have these cut off and maybe the threads messed up and it held on there than risk ripping those off with a rock. So I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on each one of these studs as well, And then I'm also going to put some washers on there because the nuts that came with them just aren't really big enough to kind of jump the gap in that plate. So now that those nuts are run down, I'm just going to take my torque wrench and finish tightening them down to 21 foot-pounds. Alright guys, that's all there is to change out the transmission mount on a Jeep TJ. If this video helped you out, please like the video, drop a comment down there and tell me. And then as always, if you aren't subscribed, please think about subscribing to the channel. If you have a TJ, I have tons of helpful content from general maintenance to aftermarket parts installs and even a lot of off-road footage. So this is a great channel for you. Be sure to check out my other videos, and I'll see you on the next one.